he should want to do this in order to seek the ajr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, without a doubt. And this is really the wonderful thing about Islam, in the sense of the value that it places on humanity, the value it places on caring for the sick. These are such rewardable actions that Muslims should be primarily
There are some individuals, I wouldn't say a lot of them, they have this view that you should not be seeking medicine because of the hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, which is reported in line Sahih Bukhari.
And Islam came and dispelled that categorically. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned in the Quran that there's no blame on the blind, there's no blame on the disabled. He says very, very clearly, dispelling any kind of idea of attributing blame. Today we find that in a lot of cases in the West, a lot of medical research, a lot of social care, a lot of it's dependent upon charitable donations. There's multitude of charities, but this is actually the responsibility of the state from an Islamic perspective to take care of its people.
Assalamu alaikum. Alhamdulillah, salatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Jazakumullah khairan for another Seeking Mind postcard. We'll be addressing issues that Muslims face in modern time, the modern challenges. Today we have a very important topic, and it's about biology, it's about medicine, it's about the Islamic civilization in these issues. Today my co-host is Wasim Khan, and we have a special guest, Dr Salman Rahman. He is a vascular biologist, and he will be addressing the issue about medicine and biology in the Islamic world. Now, before we go into that, let's find out a bit more about our guest, Mr. Salman.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
And what got you into this, becoming a biologist?
Yeah, I think from an early age, I was always had an interest in science. So when I was at school, I used to always pick out the science books, in primary school, from the library, and read about, the solar system and the universe. And as I got older, I got more interested in biology. I think it was my sister that actually got me interested in biology. She's older than me, and she was used to study biology at school, and she used to bring home and sort of teach me, and I sort of got an interest from her. And then as I got, developed in my own sort of education, it seemed to be more about biology and medicine that really interested me. So it came a point in my education that I had to decide whether to do a career in medicine or a career in biology, biochemistry, molecular biology. And I chose to go down the molecular biology route, and that's basically.
What kind of advice would you give to students coming up doing this?
I think it depends, on what you find interesting. If you really, on what motivates you. I mean, medicine is a wonderful area to go into, because obviously it's something that is very rewardable. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Man ahyaha faka'annama ahya hannasa jamiya. Whoever saves a life is if he has saved the life of the whole of humanity. So the reward for saving a single life is equivalent to saving the entire humankind. So that is, fantastic motivation for anyone to want to go into medicine and to actually, work with sick people and try to help them to recover. But at the same time, studying biology, if you go into the biomedical sciences, you can also sort of feed into that loop, if you like. And I'm also in that area where I have a strong interest in developing new medicines. So new medicines themselves, as interventions, can also help to, people who are sick, help to cure them.
I wanted to ask about what you said earlier about what you're passionate about. That goes into things like intentions, right? So do you know some people go into medicine for or become a doctor sometimes for the money, but in the end they are saving lives, right? So would they be? And then you said earlier, if you save one life, it's as if you saved the whole of humanity. So would you say that they're also getting that reward, or?
Yeah, I think the motivation for anyone who goes into medicine has to be humanitarian motivation. I mean, people will undoubtedly associate it with a career that pays a decent wage. Actually, to be honest, now working in the NHS isn't like that. People who work in the NHS work long hours and they're not getting paid the sort of money that people can get paid in the city, for example. So you're talking about the cream of the cream when it comes to the education system. Our people who study medicine generally are the best of the best, but they don't get a huge salary, and they work astronomically long hours. So the motivation for those people has to be wanting to go into that field for the humanitarian value.
Normally, in like the capitalist system, say in America or anywhere across the world, I think the UK is special in that, like, because the NHS, they don't pay the doctors properly. But normally, across the world, doctors get a really high pay for their craft.
They do. Especially, and the more you specialise, the higher you get paid. That's true. You get paid a decent wage, but if you compare it with other areas, like if you compare it with business, if you can compare it with finance, I mean, the kind of salaries that those people get is significantly higher. And these people are so educated, they could go into any field, essentially, So I think there is always a humanitarian element to people going into medicine.
But what about spiritual? What about Islamic perspective from that?
So, absolutely, for a Muslim, he should want to do this in order to seek the ajr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, without a doubt. And this is really the wonderful thing about Islam, in the sense of the value that it places on humanity, the value it places on caring for the sick. These are such rewardable actions that Muslims should be primarily motivated by these things. Absolutely. But let's face it, we don't live in an Islamic society. We live in a society where status and earnings and have high prominence, have a high value. So that's a kind of a balance or a challenge that Muslims living in the West have to deal with.
Yeah, there is what about this? There are some individuals, I wouldn't say a lot of them, they have this view that you should not be seeking medicine because of the hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, which is reported in line Sahih Bukhari, that 70,000 people will be given Jannah straight because they do not do ruqya and they rely completely on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So because of this, and they have this, it's something that the disease that Allah has given you. So why are you so...
Actually, that's a very interesting point you raised there, because if you look at it historically, in the ancient times, even in the times, pre-Islamic times, and in the time when Christianity was coming to, becoming a big civilization, there was this view that if a person had a disease or if he was disabled, it was kind of like his destiny, Allah's decree, and or in some cases it was a punishment for that person. And Islam came and dispelled that categorically. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned in the Quran that there's no blame on the blind, there's no blame on the disabled. He says very, very clearly, dispelling any kind of idea of attributing blame to someone who has a disease. And the Prophet ﷺ was asked this question by a Sahabi once. The Sahabi once asked him, Rasulullah, I'm paraphrasing, he said, Rasulullah ﷺ, are the du'as that we make for being healed and the medicine we take, is this changing the qadr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And the Prophet said, no, it's part of the qadr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So these things are actually things which Islam encourages and doesn't, try to dispel people from taking medicines. Having said that, from a Shari perspective, taking medicine is not obligatory. So it's something that is recommended. It's mandub. And in most of the sort of schools of fiqh, they would tell you that there's no compulsion on anyone to take medicine. So if you want to avoid taking medicines and leave your destiny in the hands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you're perfectly entitled to do so. But at the same time, the sunnah is encouraging one to take medicine.
Okay. There are a lot of issues regarding transplant, for example, heart transplant. So there is this argument that I've come across, and I'm not sure if you're aware of. They believe, some sections of our ummah believe that the thinking, the fiqh, takes place in the heart. And now if you're changing the heart, you're changing the person. And so they have these theological arguments against it. What are your views on that? What is the...
I mean, on that particular point, there's been multiple heart transplants. Heart transplants have been taking place since the 1950s or early 60s. And so there's been thousands of heart transplants, and you don't see people changing personality as a consequence of having these heart transplants. And what you have to understand is that from an Islamic perspective, we view life and organs and the human life in a distinct way. So there's an issue of biological life, where an organ can be a living thing, like it has cells that are living, that are dividing, that are consuming energy, and having particular function. In the heart, it's a muscle, so it contracts. So that's a biological aspect of life. But from our perspective as human life, we understand that human life is to do with ensoulment and the ruh, which about which we have absolutely no knowledge. Allah has kept this something which is hidden from us. So we don't know anything about the ruh and about how it comes or when it is taken away, other than what is mentioned in the text regarding these matters. So when it comes to issues like organs and they're used for transplantation, the issue now really is not about whether you should avoid it because you're somehow transferring the ruh along with it. That's not the case. The issue is really one about where do you get these organs from, who do they belong to, and can you transplant a particular organ or not?
So person that passes away, there's an issue of ownership as well, milkiyya, that you passed away, everything belongs to Allah. So if someone passed away, can you transplant his kidneys to someone else? Does he have that right to do that? Do we have that?
So this is an issue where there's differences, ikhtilaf among ulama on this issue. But when it comes to the issue of ownership, there's no, from what I have understood and from what I've studied, there's no indication that anyone owns the organs of a person after they pass away. When you're alive, you as a person own your own organs. They belong to you. And this is based upon the ruling of diya, blood money. So the blood money is paid to a person when he's been injured in some way. And because of that issue, the ulama have said that indicates that you have ownership over your body, because your body is injured and you get compensated for that. But when a person passes away, that no longer occurs. So nobody actually owns that person's body. Obviously he doesn't, because he's not in any ability to have any oversight over his body, having passed away. But neither does his relatives, neither does the state. So really, the body actually, the ownership goes back to the original owner, if you like, which is Allah.
I'd like to bring in that topic to genetic modification. So like in that sense, right, because we own our bodies, right, then does that mean we according to Islamic framework, have the authority to edit, you could say, so like gene modification?
Yeah, so because we have ownership over our bodies, we can use our body parts in a way to promote medicine and medical health. So for example, I can give a blood transfusion to somebody who needs a blood transfusion, and that is giving an organ, because your blood is an organ, right? So, and if medicine wanted, for example, to genetically modify that blood in some way, okay, in order to make it more effective in treating a particular disease, or if you wanted to modify an organ system, to make it a better type of medicine, So for example, there's this new therapy now that's being used to treat cancer, where the patient's own immune cells are taken from him, and then they're genetically modified in such a way, and then they're put back into his body. And those immune cells will now actually specifically target the cancer, the tumor, and kill the tumor. It's called CAR T therapy, okay? And so in this case, you're taking your own body's cells, you're putting them in a laboratory, you're genetically modifying them, and you're putting new instructions into the cells in order to tell the cell, become a cell that will fight this particular cancer that that's in your body growing. And you put those cells back in the body, and they will start to fight the cancer. And that's all part of medical technology, and there's nothing in Sharia to forbid.
Wouldn't that infringe upon the concept of changing the creation of Allah?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
No, because there's evidence in the Sunnah that you can, use technology in order to enhance, the performance of things. So, for example, the Arabs in the time of the Prophet ﷺ used to cross-pollinate date palms. Okay, and they used to produce better quality dates from that. So and the Prophet ﷺ said to them, it might be better that you don't do that. So they took it to mean, from a Shari perspective, his words, And so they stopped doing it, and their yield began to diminish. So they went back to the Prophet ﷺ and said, look, you told us not to do this, and our yields have gone right down. And he says, and the Prophet ﷺ replied, you know best how to deal with your affairs. Yeah. So this is making a distinction between, sort of science and technology, which is kind of like a universal element to do with things like how do things work? How do you get the best yield out of crops? How do you get the best yield out of a herd by crossbreeding, animals, for example? This indicates that we are permitted to use technology to enhance yield, enhance performance of tissues and medicines.
So to what extent does what Nurbai say about you can't change the creation of Allah, to what extent does this apply?
So this really depends on where I've seen it being quoted is to do with things like trying to change the human being, like things like cloning. So for example, a couple of decades ago, scientists cloned a sheep, and it was for Dolly the sheep, right? So these are scientists in Scotland who developed this technology of cloning animals, and by extension, it should be possible to clone human beings, but doing so would have to circumvent the way in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created the human. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Ya ayyuhan nas, inna khalaqnakum min dhakarin wa untha. That we have created you, O mankind, we have created you from a male and a female. But with cloning, you don't need to have a male and a female. You can actually just create a human being from a single cell, taken from, say, your skin or from another part of your body. You can just use that cell, and you can take the genetic material from that cell and implant it into the egg of a donor, female donor, whose nucleus or genetic material has been taken out. And then you can basically, from that egg, create a fertilization scenario which could potentially develop into a human. So there would be no father and mother here, So this is clearly, against the Quran and Sunnah on this element. So we would not allow humans to be cloned.
So would you say the same for like plastic surgery or genetic enhancement, like let's just say super soldiers or something?
So this is a good question. I mean, the idea that you can genetically enhance embryos to produce traits is something that now is potentially possible. And for example, there was a scientist in China that genetically edited embryos, and some children were born in a genetically edited manner. He was actually punished for this by the Chinese state and jailed for 3 years. But essentially, what they did there was to try and modify a particular gene in the embryo to make those children immune to being infected by HIV. So they were children from.
A good thing, right? Yeah, exactly.
Well, potentially it's a good thing, but the technology he used is still a very untested technology. It's a very sort of early stage technology. Okay. So we don't know what the impacts that technology could have in terms of having side effects. So this was the danger. It was really an untested technology, and he just went ahead and did this without really any oversight. Did it kind of secretly, broke rules and regulations, and was punished. But then the seriousness of this is a very, very serious matter, because not only this is a potentially important technology, but if there's a negative element, then the negative publicity will mean that people and society will now kind of be against the use of this technology in the future, when it could potentially be very helpful. So could we particularly genetically enhance things? We could potentially remove disease. Many diseases are congenital. So you inherit certain diseases from your parents, things like sickle cell anemia, things like hemophilia. You inherit defective genes, which are ultimately responsible for you having that disease. It could be possible with using gene editing technologies to correct those genes so that you don't have that disease anymore in the child. So you could correct the gene in the embryonic stage, and the child will be born healthy, inshallah. So this is, very powerful, potentially very, very powerful medical technologies, but they're not quite there at the moment. They still need development. Yeah.
So what's okay? Let's go into the issue of it's growing right now in terms of gender transformation. What is the Islamic position on men becoming women they're changing their genitals and all this.
No, it's completely prohibited. You know, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created, man and woman, and there's no, and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam even forbade men to behave like women or to dress like women, or to behave in an effeminate way, yet alone to actually try and transform yourself into a woman. So there's no permission for that.
Let's go into civilization. Well, I want to understand the Islamic. How important is the state in these issues? Because one thing is about the healthcare. Is there free healthcare in the state? How does Islam deal with these kind of things?
Yeah, and let me complement that. So
Yeah.
we're seeing new technologies like genetic enhancement, things like plastic surgery, like all these things, right? Right now, who's determining what's right and wrong is by the capitalist system, right? So so I wanted to go into that. Like, what is the possible harms in that?
Okay, so these are big topics, alhamdulillah. We'll try and deal first with one and then I'll come back to your question. The issue of the state, if you look even in the various earliest stages of the establishment of the city-state of Medina, you will find, compelling evidence that there was, specific policies towards healthcare. For example, the Prophet ﷺ would, there's a very famous incident that took place. The Emperor Heraclius, who was the emperor of the Roman Empire at the time, he sent a physician personally to the Prophet ﷺ as a sort of a goodwill gesture. And this physician, came to the Prophet and says, "I've been sent as your personal physician." And the Prophet said, "I want you to provide healthcare to the entire community. We'll look after your bed and board. You're our guest, but you provide healthcare to the entire community." And after about 6 months of staying in Medina, nobody had seen him. And he says, "Oh, look, I'm not being used here. Can I go back home?" And the Prophet ﷺ said to him, "It's up to you. You're welcome to stay, but if you want to go, you can go." And he said, "My Sahaba," he said, "my companions, they don't fall sick because they only eat when they're hungry, and they don't overfill themselves. They don't overeat, and they keep themselves extremely clean. They're very conscious of personal hygiene." And so this indicates you can learn many lessons from this. One is the emphasis on maintaining a healthy lifestyle, not overeating, eating which is tayyib, eating the good food, pure food, and also the tahara that we do in terms of our spiritual cleanliness also helps to keep ourselves clean. But also there was this issue that this doctor was given to provide healthcare freely without charge. So this indicates that the state will provide free healthcare, and the basis for this in terms of the Shari basis is the fact that the head of state, the Imam, Prophet said, in a famous hadith, "Al-Imam ra'in, wa huwa mas'ulan an ra'itihi," that the Imam is a guardian, is a shepherd, and he is responsible for his people, for his flock. So this indicates that the Imam has to, protect his people at all times. He has to look after his people at all times, prevent any kind of harm. And and harm includes things like disease, things like chronic diseases, ill health. You have to prevent that. So you prevent that by having a healthcare system. And so the Khilafah will have a healthcare system.
Wasn't there a lot of independent waqf based?
Yes, there was. I mean, there's nothing against having charitable donations or private donations to support institutions, but these institutions are the responsibility of the state. So today we find that in a lot of cases in the West, a lot of medical research, a lot of social care, a lot of it's dependent upon charitable donations. There's multitude of charities, but this is actually the responsibility of the state from an Islamic perspective to take care of its people. And the responsibility falls on the shoulders of the state and the head of state. So although charities you can give in charity, we will not rely on them.
But to stop it from this, look at this society. We have the pharmaceutical industry, the multinational companies. I mean, if you look at it, they have the stronger influence. They patent laws over the government. Now, what is there to prevent that happening in the Khilafah system?
So in the Khilafah system, we will have a state-owned pharmaceutical industry, which will be producing medicines and producing them at a price which doesn't prioritize profit margins over people's welfare. So that would mean that any sort of private pharmaceutical industry that would develop in the Khilafah would have to work within that environment. And so when it comes to things like pricing, it won't be able to inflate its prices, which is very common now in the Western pharmaceutical industry, which is entirely reliant on a private pharmaceutical industry. And so they can more or less set the prices they want, and it's been documented, repeatedly, that they inflate their prices well above inflation, and to such an extent that some people, I don't know if you know about people who are diabetics in America, for example, the cost of insulin, despite the fact that insulin has been around since the 1920s, it is still so expensive that people have to ration the insulin they use because they just can't afford it. And that rationing of their own insulin is actually causing people to die, early when they shouldn't be. So, this is a really serious situation where the prices of drugs have to be affordable. And now you find that healthcare systems around the world are unable to afford to pay for the price of new medicine. Some of the latest technologies, such as the one I was telling you about, the CAR T therapies, which are used to treat cancer, these therapies are literally millions of dollars per dose. One therapy can cost a patient, a couple of $1 million. Healthcare systems will have to use that very, very sparingly, and only the most sort of sick patients who have failed all other types of therapies would be offered that type of therapy because it costs so much. So it's a real problem.
And what is it about the capitalist system that promotes this kind of greed to inflate the price of medicine? And what about Islam specifically prevents that type of effect from going on?
So under capitalism, profit is the bottom line is very, very important. You can't, if you look at things like medical innovation, ask anyone who is trying to develop a new medicine or a new medical technology. From the earliest days, you're thought to think about how is this going to make money, because you need private investment. And those private investors are going to want to have a return on their investment. And really the thing they care about more than anything else is how much money you're going to make them. And it's not hidden, it's not a secret. They actually teach you this. They teach you this when they're trying to build entrepreneurship in scientists. You're taught that you have to think about the business model from the earliest stages, because if you can't make money, then you're not going to get funding. And so this is the whole thing. The whole thing is driven by profit and by the revenue that you can generate, and consequently you have to understand the markets. So from an Islamic perspective, this is not the motivation. The motivation here is to fulfill the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is to bring treatments and to bring welfare to humanity. And so the state will drive this, and because the state will drive this, then any sort of private pharmaceutical industry that develops alongside state industry will have to work with that environment. They won't be able to inflate prices to sort of ridiculous levels, because the state will also be producing similar medicines at much lower prices.
Plus, thinking about it, right? If you look at the underlying value of an Islamic society, right? Like you said at the beginning of the podcast, if you save one life, it's as if you saved all of humanity. That's a fundamental, you could say, societal value. Absolutely. That Muslims across, the state will have.
Absolutely.
While here, in the capitalist system, that's not as promoted. That's seen more as because of how each individual works, right? It's not a common societal value, right? It's an individualistic value to, just be good. But in the end, the common societal value, right, is to make
money. Exactly. And it's not, we shouldn't just blame the pharmaceutical industry. This is across the board. It's all innovation across, other industries as well, whether it's, electronics or aviation or whatever you're talking about, the car industry. It's the same thing. It's the bottom line. It's about profit margins and revenue and markets. So this is not something that, the pharmaceutical industry has got some sort of special evil sort of motivation behind it. It's just the environment it finds itself in. Exactly. And so consequently, you have to work within that environment, and that's why, You know, they say the cost of developing a new drug can be anywhere up to $3 billion from laboratory research to bedside. That journey can be up to be $3 billion. And the failure rate is around 90%. But 90% of all programs developing new medicines fail.
Okay, speaking on the cost, now look, this is something I don't understand how Islam will deal with this. You're talking about 3 billion just for the beginning, yeah? How does the state, and I understand the Khilafah doesn't have income tax, it doesn't have VAT. How does the Khilafah state fund the research? Where does it get money from?
You have to understand these numbers which are quoted for innovation, they occur within the capitalist system where you have this huge inflation. Okay. So in the Khilafah state, you won't have this huge inflation, and you won't have people motivated by revenue and profit and markets in the same way that it occurs in the capitalist system. So the cost of production is going to be much lower, first and foremost. But then again, you think about the energy, you know, the human capital that goes into developing these types of technologies. In the Khilafah, the motivation is not going to be driven by money and profit. You know, we're a society built upon Islam. And we'll be a society built upon the sublime values of Islam. So the motivation is going to be different, you know. So that will all drive the prices of these things down much lower. And the energy will be there to develop these things, whether in the public sector or the private sector.
Yeah, it goes back to what you said earlier about passion, right?
Absolutely.
Like, even if the people in a capitalist society, their passion is to be humanitarian, because the societal value, causes people to think about the money, think about the careers, right? They'll be motivated, or you can say the societal value of seeking money will always overpower their humanitarian.
It is the predominant force, you know, in the economy. So ultimately, you will not be able to achieve those things without having to work within that framework. And that's ultimately what it boils down to. You know, you even those people who, I mean, all of us who go into medicine or biology to some degree, we all have this. You know, I work with many non-Muslim scientists, and they all have this value to help humankind. Yeah. It's very strong in them. It's very strong in them. But the reality of how the system works in terms of how the innovation ecosystem works. You're forced to adopt the principles of capitalist economics.
Because if you think about let's just say all three of us, even we're influenced by it. Our gas bills, right, are inflated because all these gas companies, demand more from the government than what's expected of them. Even though in British land, there's the gas is already there. So if the state had owned it in the first place, these corporates wouldn't be able to charge more than they need, or the housing, because the government hasn't built houses across across London. Rent prices are again inflated.
So here you're really talking about the corruption within the democratic system. The democratic system lends itself to corruption, and when you look at things like the pharmaceutical industry, they have these companies, these big pharma companies. They're very powerful. You know, these are multi-billion-dollar companies, so they can use that power to lobby politicians to develop laws and systems which benefit them, and that happens. It's not hidden at all. It's an open fact. So this is one of the problems with the democratic system, which in Islam won't be the case, because our system doesn't work with under those sorts of principles.
Okay, so what about COVID-19, for example? We saw that it was made, the state got involved in this society. In an Islamic society, can the state force certain things on the people to take, certain medicine to take?
So this is a balance between the right of the individual and the right of the community. Yeah. So ordinarily, as we mentioned at the beginning, you can't force people to take medicines, because from a Sharia perspective, a person doesn't have to take medicine. He can rely on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But then there becomes an issue where if the society is potentially going to be harmed, there's an epidemic or a pandemic, as in the case which took place in COVID, then the issue here now becomes one of protecting the society and protecting the vulnerable. In COVID, young people were generally not really at risk. It was the elderly population who was at risk, and so, to protect them, it became imperative to develop some kind of a vaccine that could protect those people, and the same thing could happen in the Khilafah. If we found that there was a pandemic that was threatening society-wide, was any particular group or the entire society, then, as we mentioned, the Imam is a shepherd. Al-Imam Ra'in. He's there to protect his people. So he may, in some situations, issue a decree or a canon where, people would be forced to take medication in order to protect the wider society. That could occur.
Okay, you mentioned that the Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam was given by the Byzantines a physician to have the medication. Now, there's an argument I've come across that the Islamic civilization, when it comes to medicine, biology, you're all dependent upon the Romans and the Persians. We actually copied them, imitated them. We didn't come out with any originality. What's your views regarding that?
Well, the first thing is that science and technology is not something which is specific to a particular civilization. Okay, so when we understand how does the world work, this is essentially, how does the universe work? How does our body work? These are all things which all human beings can study, and it's not an issue which is that is sort of skewed towards a particular viewpoint about life. We're studying, the things which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created, his universe and man and life with certain systems and fixed laws and fixed principles, which we can study and we can elucidate through experimentation, through empiricism. And so, we generally, humankind builds knowledge upon previous knowledge. So the knowledge that previous civilizations had, like the Greeks and the Romans, the Muslims would have been aware of those things, and they would have then built on top of that. And that's exactly what has happened. And the current Western civilization has built upon what the Muslims have left, from the Islamic civilization. There were certain Islamic medical textbooks which were written 700, 800 years ago, which were being used in Western medicine up until about 100 years ago or 150 years ago. So they were used, the same textbooks were being used for like 700 years because they were so advanced, So, we know that in the Abbasid era, there was the golden age of Islam. We had these, huge scientific establishments and scientific advancements that's in that particular era. And that will continue, even through the Ottoman era as well. So we've got this very rich history and very rich culture of science and technology.
I remember a lot of the students from Europe, they used to come to the Muslim world in order to learn, medicine. Places like Al-Andalus or Baghdad.
That's right. Absolutely right. They used to come and study in our universities. In fact, the earliest universities were built by the Muslims. Actually, it was a woman who established one of the world's first universities. And so, in both men and women in Islam have got this rich history of studying the sciences, studying technology and developing technologies.
So where are they? Where, you're talking about Ibn Sina, I think, Al-Faris, Ibn Jazari. Where are they? We don't have like this in the Muslim world today. Where are these thinkers, scientists, medicines?
I mean,
what happened?
The problem is that we have, the Muslim world is living in a post-colonial era. We're in a post-Sykes-Picot world where historically the Muslim world has not really been free. It's not really been independent. And so we've not been motivated to develop in the way in which we could have developed. We're starting to see, certain pockets in areas where things are starting to change, but a lot of it again is driven by, the West. We find Western institutions in places like, the Gulf countries establishing Western institutions and so on and so forth. But we're seeing little places, places like in Pakistan, Iran, in Turkey, we're starting to develop technologies now, from our own people, developing from our own institutions. So that is starting to change, but it's nowhere near where we should be.
Yeah. So what's missing?
What's missing is ultimately, that Islamic motivation, because the systems in our countries are not Islamic systems, and we're not brought up with an Islamic education system. We're brought up essentially with a Western education system in all of our countries, And essentially that motivation that we would have, which would be unique to the Islamic education system, is not there.
That's interesting. How where we were from the Abbasids to the Uthmani, and then suddenly we just declined immediately. It was that's a shocking thing for.
Well,
the
it's not,
Ummah.
it's not, you know, the fact that we did decline, but we have stagnated. You know, it's been like a period of 100 years where, you know, it's only in the last maybe like 20, 30 years we're starting to see a slight change, you know, in things. But generally, you know, there are no, you know, very few Nobel laureates from the Muslim world, for example. You know, there are inventions being developed, but we're nowhere near at the level where we should be. You know, look at China and how China has risen in the last sort of 40 years. You know, that China is now is ahead of the curve, and it's ahead of the West in many areas of technology, including medicine. And that's because they've essentially transformed their society and become an independent state which can forge its own path. We in the Muslim world still don't have that independence.
I remember, just before China's rise, right, there was someone called Deng Xiaoping. He's one of the, you can say, the architect of China's new rise, and the first thing he focused on was education, and it just shows the importance of education and bringing back
Investing in your own people. That's right, absolutely, and we haven't done that in the Muslim world. You know,
We can't, because we are colonized, we are dictated. There's laws over us. Look at Syria right now. They have to make a lot of compromises.
Absolutely, and look at what happened recently when Trump went to Saudi Arabia and the Gulf. How all that money that's being spent to buy Western technology. Why not invest that money in our institutions and develop our own technologies? Look how much money was spent on the World Cup, the Football World Cup, $220 billion. I mean, you could have solved world poverty with that kind of money. You know, just imagine if you had invested that money across the Muslim world in science and innovation and in education. What could you have done with that? So this is the problem, that our resources and our wealth is just being squandered and it's not being used where it should be used. And we would be leading the world in every sector if we invested our resources and our human capital properly. No reason why we shouldn't be.
Okay, looking forward, where do you see this Islamic civilization pushing, rising? And do you see that any time soon, or is there going to be another 100 years that we're going to be like this? I mean, it's quite depressing knowing what we have.
I mean, obviously, things are bad at the moment, especially with what's happening in the Muslim world, what's happening in Palestine and in Gaza. These are awful things to witness. But, you know, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has, in every sort of bad situation, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sometimes puts a good thing in there, which may be beyond our vision, beyond our understanding. And one of the things which has come out as a result of all this terrible situation is that you found the power of community. You know, the Muslims have actually defeated the Western powers and the Zionists in the narrative, in the war narrative that's been here. We've actually defeated them, and because of the impact of community and the access to certain technologies like the internet, which has allowed us to be able to make our arguments and show the truth behind the lies which we see in the corporate media. So, alhamdulillah, we see that there is a change occurring, and this is not just a change in the Muslim world. This is a change which is occurring in the Western world. You know, so this, alhamdulillah, the lies and the deceit which the West has used through its control over media has been broken to a large extent. So, inshallah, we will hope that from this terrible situation, something positive will rise, inshallah, with the rise of Islam, with the establishment of an Islamic state, inshallah, and the unification of the Ummah.
Okay, you got any more questions?
Yeah, I wanted to ask, in my generation, right, things like health and fitness, it's a big thing. I go to a gym, I see the thing is, I don't see a lot of the Muslim brothers in the masjids as one. I see a lot of them in the gym, surprisingly. So you can see a cultural value as well, not just in the Muslims but in the non-Muslims as well.
So there's been, I think everyone can sense that there's been a shift in the younger generation towards keeping themselves fit and healthy, and going to the gym now has become like a normal thing now for every young person. And alhamdulillah, this is a good thing, in the sense that you're looking after your health, but it should be matched with other things as well. Like for example, the Prophet gave a lot of instructions about how to maintain your health. Eat healthy, eat tayyib, eat the pure food. Go to bed early, get up early. These kinds of things, which were part of his sunnah. These things are all part of that healthy lifestyle, as well as exercises. The Prophet used to wrestle. Famously he raced his wife Aisha. So this kind of idea of keeping yourself fit and doing exercise is part of our 1400-year culture.
I remember you said earlier that when the doctor from the Caesar at the time, right?
Yeah.
When he came to Medina, right?
Yeah.
Like he didn't have anyone to
right.
Because like all the Sahabas, they all ate healthy, they were active, So
That's
like,
right.
is it like you could say, this kind of transformation can only occur if the entire society is following one kind of cultural value, one societal value, right? So would you say is like this health lifestyle, this fitness lifestyle, is it like a Islamic value to have?
It's in the Sunnah of Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. He was the one who showed everybody how to live. As Aisha famously said, he was a walking Quran. So he was the one who inspired the Sahaba to live like that. Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam never overate. There's hadith which says that Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam never had a full meal in his entire prophethood. Never had a full meal. So he always, he never overeating is a terrible problem. We have obesity now in Western societies, where people just overeat, consume way too many calories. And this is causing a lot of diseases like metabolic diseases, diabetes is skyrocketing because of this. So Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam didn't overeat, he ate the pure food, that is mentioned in the Quran. So these healthy lifestyle choices were actually part of the Sunnah, which the Sahaba just followed.
Exactly. Like, could you give examples, like in this society of, you could say, the pure food and the impure food? Like, what would say if the Prophet ﷺ was here right now, right? What would he recommend, and what would he not recommend?
I mean, there's a lot of science in the Prophet. Obviously, we have halal and haram food, so we eat the halal food and we eat the things which Allah subhanahu has mentioned, and He's prohibited us from eating certain types of food. We don't consume alcohol. We don't consume pork, these kinds of things. So and He's described all the other things which are halal for us to eat. So this we consider is the pure food, as opposed to the impure food. But on top of that, there's a lot of research to indicate that we should eat, food which is, there's a lot of processed food out there now.
Yeah.
And the problem with processed food is that it can often give you ingredients in a way which is in an unhealthy levels. You get a lot of salt in processed food, a lot of sugar in certain kinds of foods, and these things are not healthy. If you consume them, overconsumption of these types of ingredients. So really, eating healthy food is like making your own food, using your own ingredients, not relying on all these kinds of processed items, is better, is more healthy. Yeah.
Also, like, I remember, are you of the opinion that the more processed the food, right, the more like unhealthy it is? Like,
in a lot of cases, processed food can come with a lot of unhealthy elements. Food which comes from natural, unprocessed sources tends to have nutrients in a very sort of balanced way. There's a lot of, I'm not a nutritionist, but there's a lot of data now indicating that it's not just about getting nutrition into your body. It's how it's presented to your body. Certain things like vegetables will present certain types of nutrients in a certain way that your gut will absorb them at a certain rate, in a certain manner, which you don't get in processed foods. You just get like a big delivery of a certain ingredient, which might not be suitable for your body to consume in one go. So it's those kinds of things which are starting to come into our knowledge about how to eat healthily.
Okay, all right. So, alhamdulillah, I think we come to an end on this podcast. Is there any last words that you want to share with us? Something in your field that's coming up in the innovation world that we need to.
I mean, I think we live in a very, very exciting time for innovation. You know, so there's lots of new sort of disruptive technologies which are coming out. You know, across the world we know about AI. So AI is going to impact virtually everything, and it will impact medicine as well. But there are now sort of new medical technologies which really have very, very promising potential to provide curative therapies. Things like sort of genetic medicines, things like these CAR T therapies. In the field, we have a technical term for it. It's called advanced therapies or cell and gene therapies. This is probably the newest sort of modality, which is currently sort of very new and being developed at the moment. And it's very exciting because you can essentially have medicines where you just give one dose, and that can be, you know, can have a transformative effect. Whereas, you know, most medicines you have to take them continually, you know. Like, you know, you take pills every day, or if you're dealing with a biological medicine, you may have to have injections every month or every 2 weeks, you know. But these medicines, these genetic medicines, they kind of use your own body as the factory to produce the medicine in some cases. And so you can just take one dose and that's it.
It's amazing. Amazing. Okay, inshallah, we'll bring this podcast to an end. Jazakallah for listening. We do address a lot of issues. So today we talked about the biology and medicine world. Inshallah, coming up, we'll have discussions about the environment, discussions about history. So inshallah, tune in and keep your, subscribe to the channel, inshallah. Jazakumullah khairan for both of you. So, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.